Hey guys, what's up? Public here, back with another video, and today, as requested, we're going to go over class talents specifically inside of Mythic Plus PvE environments and talk about kind of your base class talents and the options that you have within keys. Let's dive in. Alright, so Priest is one of the kind of unique specs in the game right now, I think, or at least classes in the game, where we actually have quite a bit of choice when it comes to our class talent tree and what we can take. And the Icy Veins guide goes over this a little bit, so I'm going to kind of walk through some of what it's saying, but realistically, you kind of have a fall through of choices based on what you need. So you're kind of starting out with pick up all the base stuff that you need to have, all the damage throughput that's required, and then from there, add whatever defensive, you can kind of fill in with all the required utility points that you need for whatever you're doing. So you kind of fall through that depending on what you're doing. So we're going to start off with just going by what those kind of required bits are, either for pathing or for damage. So starting off, and this is kind of in no particular order, we're always going to take Dispel Magic, and to be honest, almost every single dungeon that you're doing is going to get some value out of this. Maybe not all the time, but pretty consistently. We also use this to path through Improved Flash Heal to get Protective Light. This is one of our most valuable defensive points and something that you're just going to take all the time because of how easy it is to get to. Similarly, we're also going to path through Holy Nova, even though we don't actually press Holy Nova for anything, just to get Spell Warding. I know for anyone of you asking, Rhapsody is not worth it as a priest. Unfortunately, Holy Nova doesn't generate Insanity, which is one of the main things driving what we're pressing. So even though it does do some damage, it's not worth taking. Now, as far as other required stuff, moving on to the right-hand side, we're always going to take Death and Madness. It's not a massive throughput node in the tree, especially now that we're not pressing Shadow Word Death as much, but it is rewarding that kind of sniping of Shadow Word Death and giving us a bit more execute damage when targets get low enough. Now for that, this is where we start to get into some of the choices. I almost always will take Leap of Faith here, one for pathing and two just because, used well, you can certainly save people, or, if they jump into a wrong area, you can get them out of it. I also almost always will take Dominate Mind as well. Although a caveat with this is, if there's a case where you feel like you need Void Tendrils, which in Season 4 really isn't much, you could drop this as like a pathing point, because Dominate Mind does have some niche use cases, but it's kind of hit or miss. I do have a section in the guide rather, that in Icy Veins that goes over like some interesting mobs to mind control inside of Mythic Plus. I've only found a couple this season so far, but as we find more, I'll update that list below. From here on out, we do need to take through Power Infusion and Twins of the Sun Priestess. This is just such a massive DPS gain for you and someone else that you cast Power Infusion on. We also pick up Twist of Fate, giving us that execute threshold, which also, if you didn't know, this can proc through healing as well, so that's also pretty sweet. And then to kind of finish out our pathing, some other stuff, Tithe Evasion is still pretty required. If you're pressing Shadow or Death at all, especially as you get up into higher keys, yeah, the damage becomes kind of annoying, so taking this to make it deal 50% less damage is definitely a good idea. Not as important as it was in previous seasons, but definitely something that I would suggest as a default for most people. If you don't take this, it's going to make, sniping Death for Insanity hit you way harder. In addition to that, I'll also always take Vampiric Embrace and Sanlean. Just really powerful, especially if you can time this well, where you're also in cooldowns. At that point, your healer doesn't need to do anything. You can pretty much solo heal for the duration of Vampiric Embrace. And then we'll also take Throes of Pain to kind of cap off the damage stuff in this tree. Now, the other things that I will always take pretty much all the time is also some movement stuff. I personally always like to play with Angelic Feather and Body and Soul. You don't need both of them, strictly speaking, but I liked having that kind of niceness with the movement. Now, we're kind of in the point now where you're really just kind of, picking up some utility points, because we need to unlock this bottom section. We just need one more point left. For the most part, what people are going to throw in here is Mass Dispel. It's going to be a good default. And in dungeons this season, basically every dungeon has something where Mass Dispel is useful. So even as a default, this is a pretty good point. Now, I will say, you could also take Psychic Voice. This is kind of an underrated point, I think, since they made the change where Psychic Scream is actually uncapped now in terms of how many enemies it hits. So it's actually quite useful as an AoE interrupt tool, and frankly, sometimes more valuable than even Silence is. With this talent, you're getting Psychic Scream down to a 30-second cooldown. It's great. So I usually end up taking Psychic Voice as well, but, this is kind of an opportunity cost with the rest of the stuff in our tree. Now, finishing off, I'll kind of go back to like the normal setup. Finishing off this bottom section, in terms of just looking at raw damage throughput, The damage zones that we have are Mind Games, Manipulation, Shadow Perceptions, and then Divine Star or Halo. Now, for a lot of people, you'll probably see Halo being used the most often. It's frankly just easier to use, and it's actually worth pressing in AoE situations for damage. Divine Star, however, is kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. You don't end up pressing this for damage during a pack, but it's really nice as like a pre-pull thing if you're running between pack to pack or right before a key starts to help build up Insanity. This is also a really nice tool, so you might see people using it for that reason. Also used well, Divine Star can output more healing, but like I mentioned, from a damage perspective, it's really not that useful. So Halo is a pretty sane default for most people. Now, from here, again, we still have to finish out our utility. Translucent Image is, again, one of those god tier defensive nodes that I think you should just always have, and also pairs really well with Improved Fade. So to finish off the tree, we have 3 points left. A lot of this comes down to preference at this point. So from here, you're kind of picking, again, what you need and what you're looking to have. So to finish off the tree, you kind of have your choice here. A lot of people like running Essence Devourer. Even though we're not running Mindbender anymore, it does actually do 3 times the healing for Shadow Fiend to kind of make up for the cooldown loss here. So just makes Shadow Fiend just a bigger healing cooldown with each of its melee swings. It's still a pretty good option, a nice little default here. You have a couple other choices as well. If you'd rather have, if you want Angelic Bulwark, you could take Crystalline Reflection down into Angelic Bulwark, just to get a bit more value into Power Word Shield. I will caveat Angelic Bulwark. The reason why I don't suggest Bulwark as a default is because frankly it's just pretty buggy. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense for most people with the way damage patterns come in. So what it says in the tooltip is when an attack brings you below 30% health, you gain an Absorb Shield equal to 15% of your max HP, and then that's on a cooldown for 90 seconds. Unfortunately, the way that it works in practice, depending on the hit of the ability, this actually just triggers if you take 30% of your health or more from a single hit. So even if you're at full life, if you go all the way down to 70 from a single hit, you can actually proc this. So it becomes a little less useful because of that. However, as you go higher up in a key, if something hits you, chances are it's going to hit you for like 70 or 80% of your health, so you're kind of getting a bit more value out of this as you go up, if that makes sense, just because of how high things are hitting you. But for everyday keys, not the best. Now, from here, you're probably saying like, okay, well, what about all the other utility in the tree? So this is where you have some choices of what to drop to pick up extra utility. Okay, so from this base tree, you kind of have to ask yourself, okay, what am I missing? What do I need to have in my build? I, for example, am always going to want to have Psychic Voice, so I'll always drop some point to make sure that I can take that. I just think it's super valuable inside of Mythic Plus. Would definitely suggest running it as often as you possibly can. Now from here, if you're in a case where a dungeon has Disease Dispels, which there are quite a few this season, I think like 3 or 4 have this, where, you could maybe cover this if your healer can do Disease Dispels, but especially if you're running with some healers, I think like Resto Shaman that can't do this, this is a really big benefit for your group is to talent into that. But as you can see here, I don't have any points left, and there's not a whole lot here that I'd be willing to drop. You could drop Crystalline Reflection here, and then you can pick up your Purified Disease, Essence Devourer node, so that could be an option here. But let's say you want even more of this, or even need more utility, for example, where Phantasm is actually situationally useful in some of these dungeons, or particularly for getting out of Entangling Weeks, if it's that affix. So where do you get those points from? The first thing that I consider dropping, if you think everything else that you need is required, is the Mind Game section. So particularly these last 3 points in Mind Games are quite small, generally speaking, where you can actually drop these 3 points and it's always going to be like a 1 to 1.5% DPS loss or less. So it's quite an insignificant point in the grand scheme of things. The main thing this is doing is on single target. It is kind of giving you something to press and kind of reducing how many like normal Mind Flays you end up casting. But inside of AoE, it's really not going to be that valuable. And you're probably thinking like, well, wait a second. Mind Games on my damage meter is never even that high. How does that make sense? You got to keep in mind that Mind Games does work through Psychic Link. So that 1.5% is taking into account that as well. Dropping the whole Mind Games node is way more costly. It gets into like 2.5% just for this one node here. But if you need the extra utility, these last 3 points are the first thing that I would end up dropping. So if you're in a case where, you need Phantasm and you're also saying like, okay, I actually want to get as much defensive value as I possibly can. Maybe you go through Crystalline Reflection. If you don't need Disease Dispel, picking up Angelic Bulwark. If you end up not needing Mass Dispel, you could drop that to, say, pick up Void Shield from a defensive perspective. Or if you're even, trying to get even more stuff, depending on what you want, you could also go through Light's Inspiration, which I'm not a huge fan of. It just increases the max health you're getting from Desperate Prayer. Typically, it's not going to be increasing it by enough that's going to be relevant in most content, but it kind of depends on what you're doing. But you can use this to path down to Benevolence or Power Word Life. Power Word Life in particular is a pretty strong heal. You just have to be, watching party frames to see when you can actually use it. If the target is actually below 35% health. Even using this as like an oh crap defensive button can be really valuable on yourself. So that's one way you could path through to get this too. You might also see some people trying out Benevolence. Unfortunately, Benevolence doesn't really work for any of the healing that we are doing as a Shadow Priest. So it doesn't work with things like Vampiric Embrace or Devouring Plague or Vampiric Touch like Leech healing. All it's really going to work for as a Shadow Priest is Flash Heal, Holy Nova if you're pressing it. It does increase the healing of Halo or Divine Star, and then it also increases the healing of Essence Devourer, but pretty much everything else in our kit is not going to work through Benevolence, so it's not really a great node for us as a Shadow Priest, but Power Word Life is a good option. A couple other kind of honorable mentions depending on what makes sense for your group. You could also consider taking Angel's Mercy. The kind of trick here is pathing through to Angel's Mercy can be quite expensive because you have to pick up Unwavering Will, which is not very useful as a Shadow Priest. It just says while you're above 75% health, cast time of Flash Heal is reduced by 10%, which is kind of like nothing. You really don't really notice this. But it does give you 20 seconds reduced cooldown on Desperate Prayer. The reason why I say this isn't super useful is typically you're not needing to use this as regularly as this, and it's really only useful if you need it 20 seconds sooner on other things. But we have so many other defensive options with Flash Heal and Fade. It's not going to be super common. So there are a lot of builds you can kind of set up. So let's go into kind of some of my defaults that I pick up. All right, so if you're playing Mythic Plus as a Shadow Priest, this is the kind of default build that I end up going with, at least for Mythic Plus in the current state. Just because Mass Dispel is used in almost every key, I just kind of pick it up as default. And I kind of rock with this first. And then you kind of go from there and say, okay, if I need extra utility, I'll actually drop the point in Void Shield if I need to pick up Purified Disease or Phantasm. And if I'm ever in a situation where I need both, that's when I start pulling from the Mind Games points here if I do need to get both. And then if you're going from there and you're like, okay, I actually need a bit more defensive value, then I'll drop these last 2 points in Mind Games to kind of move them around as needed. The first thing I'll usually pick up, if I don't already have Void Shield, is a pretty great node. But if I'm really trying to, get even a bit more defensive value in a super high key, I can go down here as well. You can see I don't have an extra point available, so that's a case of like, do I need Phantasm? Drop it for that. If you're a case where you need all of this utility up here, then I might make a decision to say drop something like Psychic Voice or even Body and Soul, depending on what I'm doing. It just kind of depends on what you're looking to accomplish for that. You could drop Feather too. Kind of depends on what you need. And those are kind of the default builds that I use for most of my stuff. This is the kind of big default that I like to run. And of course, you have a couple options here as like really niche talents. If you were looking to experiment with stuff. Shackle Undead has very situational uses as well. I did mention it, but there is the Incorporeal Affix, which is countered by Dominate Mind and Shackle Undead, so you can use both of these to help cover that affix. But keeping all this in my head is kind of difficult, so what I actually do instead, let me pull up the guide real quick. So in the Icy Veins guide, if you haven't actually seen, I have this chart here. And what this is intended to do is to help me honestly remember stuff. So I just put this up on my second monitor to remember what I need to take for that particular dungeon. So what you can do is you can actually select the dungeon that you're doing and then select the active affixes for that week. You can see not all affixes are listed here, only the ones that actually change what choices that I would suggest. So for example, if you're doing Algathar and it's Entangling week, you should take Mass Dispel, Dominate Mind, and Phantasm as the defaults that I suggest. If you want like the full list of what those are actually suggested for, the whole list is right down below. So you can kind of scroll through this and be like, oh, okay, I see that Phantasm and Halls of Infusion is useful for Deep Chill, or Mass Dispel can work on all of this stuff. You can see in just about every single dungeon, Mass Dispel is shown up here. The only one I don't have it listed for currently is Neltharis. It has some stuff in the golems at the start, but that's really it. So And I update this throughout the season and kind of what I've seen and what I've experienced. So if you're ever unsure about what class talents that I think you should have for that key, I would suggest starting here as kind of a little helpful cheat sheet, so to speak, of what you need for that particular dungeon. And then you can use the full list of what you're actually looking out for. So hopefully this was helpful in terms of like building your class tree as a Shadow Priest, particularly in Mythic Plus. That's all I have for this video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.